A millionaire forced his daughter to marry a humble driver to punish her. However, he was left speechless by what his daughter did. The Hawthorne mansion gleamed with the lights of the gala dinner. Men in suits and women in elegant dresses filled the hall, glasses clinking and laughter echoing. At the center of it all was Victor Hawthorne, the real estate magnate, smiling and greeting his guests. Elizabeth, his 25-year-old daughter, watched the scene from the corner of the room. Her heart pounded, her hands sweating as she held a champagne glass she barely sipped. She knew tonight would change everything. "It's time," she murmured to herself, placing the glass on a nearby table. With determined steps, she walked to the center of the room, where her father was addressing a group of businessmen. "Dad," she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. "Can we talk?" Victor turned, his smile faltering for a moment. "Elizabeth, dear, we're in the middle of an important conversation. Can it wait?" "No, it can't," Elizabeth replied, feeling all eyes on her. "I need to tell you something." Victor's smile disappeared completely. He excused himself from his guests and led Elizabeth to a more private corner. "What's so important that it can't wait?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I dropped out of law school." Victor's face paled. "You what?" "I dropped out," she repeated, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm going to follow my passion for photography." Victor was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing. When he spoke, his voice was low and dangerous. "You threw away your future for a hobby?" "It's not a hobby, Dad," Elizabeth argued. "It's my passion, my talent." "Talent?" Victor laughed without humor. "Taking pretty pictures isn't talent, Elizabeth. It's a pastime for people without real ambition." His words hit Elizabeth like a slap. "You don't understand. I can make a difference with my art." "Art?" Victor scoffed. "What do you know about art? You've had the best of everything, never had to fight for anything. How do you expect to capture real life in your photos?" Elizabeth felt tears welling up, but she held them back. "I can learn, Dad. I want to learn." Victor shook his head, disappointment evident in his eyes. "You're throwing away everything I built for you. Everything your mother would have wanted." The mention of her mother cut Elizabeth deeply. "You don't know what she would have wanted. You never talk about her." The argument was getting heated, attracting curious glances from the guests. Victor, noticing this, grabbed Elizabeth's arm and led her to the garden. "You're embarrassing the family," he hissed. "Go back to law school and forget this nonsense about photography." Elizabeth pulled away from her father's grip. "No. This is my life, my choice." At that moment, Jake, the family's young driver, appeared in the garden. "Is everything all right here?" Victor turned to Jake, furious. "Get back to your post. This isn't your business." But Elizabeth ran to him, embracing and kissing Jake. Victor looked from Elizabeth to Jake, his face contorted with rage. "What? My daughter and the driver? This is unacceptable." Elizabeth stood between Jake and her father. "It's none of your business, Dad. I love Jake, and he supports me, unlike you." Victor stepped forward, pointing a finger in Elizabeth's face. "None of my business? You're my daughter. I built all this so you'd have a future, and this is how you thank me." "A future I don't want," Elizabeth shouted back. "You never asked what I wanted." "What do you want?" Victor mocked. "Taking silly pictures and dating the help? That's not a life, Elizabeth. It's a childish fantasy." Jake tried to intervene. "Mr. Hawthorne, please, calm down, Dash." "Shut up," Victor roared at Jake. You're fired. Get off my property now. Elizabeth grabbed Jake's arm. If he goes, I'm going with him. Victor was silent for a moment, his eyes blazing with fury. Then, a cold smile formed on his lips. Fine. You want this life so badly? Let's see how long it lasts. He stepped closer, his voice low and threatening. Here's the deal, Elizabeth. You have 30 days to marry this driver. If you do, you won't get a single cent of the family fortune. If you don't, you're disinherited anyway. Elizabeth and Jake stood in shock. Dad, you can't be serious, Elizabeth stammered. Oh, I'm very serious, Victor replied. You want to live in the real world? Fine. See how hard it is without Daddy's money. Elizabeth felt the tears burning in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Fine, she said, her voice trembling with anger and determination. We accept your challenge. Victor seemed momentarily surprised, but quickly regained his composure. Good. Now get out of my house. You have until tomorrow to pack your things. With that, he turned and marched back to the party, leaving Elizabeth and Jake alone in the garden. Elizabeth turned to Jake, shaking. What did we just do? Jake pulled her into a tight embrace. I don't know, but we'll face it together. Are you sure about this? Elizabeth looked back at the mansion, at the life she was leaving behind, then back at Jake. She took a deep breath and nodded. I'm sure. Let's get out of here. Hand in hand, they walked away from the mansion, toward an uncertain future, but together. Inside, the party continued, unaware of the drama that had just unfolded and the new life Elizabeth and Jake were about to embark on. Elizabeth and Jake stared at their new home, a tiny apartment on the third floor of a rundown building. The smell of mold greeted them as soon as they opened the door. Well, it's ours, Jake said, trying to sound optimistic as he set down the 2 suitcases that held all their belongings. Elizabeth hesitated as she walked in, her eyes scanning the peeling walls and stained floor. The reality of their situation hit her like a punch to the gut. I can't do this, she murmured, her breathing growing unsteady. Jake, I can't live like this. Jake dropped the bags and rushed to hold her. Hey, it's going to be okay. We'll get through this. But Jake's words felt distant. Elizabeth could feel the panic rising, her vision blurring. Her legs gave out, and she slid to the floor. Elizabeth! Jake yelled, holding her. Breathe with me, okay? Slowly. He guided her breathing, patient and steady, until the panic attack subsided. Elizabeth clung to him, trembling. How are we going to live like this? She whispered. I don't know how to do anything. I've never had to worry about money before. Jake hugged her tighter. I know it's scary, but we're not alone. We have each other. In the days that followed, the harshness of their new reality became even clearer. The money Jake had saved ran out quickly. They cut expenses as much as possible, but by the end of the first week, the fridge was empty. Elizabeth looked at the barren shelves, feeling a mix of shame and desperation. I never thought I'd go hungry, she said softly. Jake hugged her from behind. We're not going to starve. I've got a few ideas. He grabbed his backpack and pulled out some odd items, fishing line, hooks, and a small first aid kit. Where did you get this? Elizabeth asked, surprised. Jake smiled slightly. Basic survival kit from the army. I always keep one with me. Elizabeth looked at him with admiration. You don't talk much about your time in the army. Jake grew serious for a moment. They're not always easy memories. They headed to a nearby park, where Jake taught Elizabeth how to fish in a small pond. It was the first time in days that Elizabeth had genuinely laughed. Back at the apartment, Jake cleaned and prepared the fish with skill. The smell of food filled the small space, making both of their stomachs growl. As they ate, Elizabeth noticed that Jake seemed lost in thought. "What are you thinking about?" she asked gently. Jake hesitated, then said, "I remembered a mission. Afghanistan. We were lost in the desert for days. I had to use these same skills to keep my unit alive." Elizabeth took his hand. "That must have been terrible." Jake nodded, his eyes distant. "We lost 2 men. I was the unit leader. I felt like I failed them." Elizabeth hugged him tightly. "You saved the others. You saved us today." Jake hugged her back, allowing himself to be vulnerable for the first time since they left the mansion. In the days that followed, they faced more challenges. The rent was overdue, and the landlord was threatening to evict them. Jake took any job he could find, from gardening to small repairs. Elizabeth tried to sell some photos online but had no luck. Despite the difficulties, they grew closer with each passing day. They shared stories, fears, and dreams. Elizabeth learned to appreciate the small things, like a sunset viewed from the apartment window. Jake rediscovered the joy of having someone to fight for. One morning, Elizabeth woke up feeling strange. Nausea hit her in waves. She rushed to the bathroom, Jake close behind, worried. "Are you okay?" he asked, holding her hair as she threw up. Elizabeth stood up, trembling, a suspicion growing in her mind. She looked at Jake, her eyes wide. "Jake," she whispered, "I think I'm pregnant." Jake's face went through a range of emotions, shock, fear, and then, slowly, a smile began to form. "A baby?" he asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and joy. Elizabeth nodded, tears in her eyes. "What are we going to do? We can barely feed ourselves." Jake held her tight. "We'll figure it out. We always do." They stood there, wrapped in each other's arms in the tiny bathroom of their rundown apartment, scared but determined. A new chapter of their lives was beginning, bringing new challenges and an even bigger reason to keep fighting. Elizabeth stared at the email on her phone, her heart sinking. The gallery had canceled her photo exhibition without explanation. It was her big chance, and now, nothing. "Jake," she called, her voice trembling. It happened again. Jake walked into the room, exhausted after another day of job hunting. "What is it, Lizzie?" "The exhibition. They canceled it." Elizabeth threw her phone onto the couch, frustrated. "It's like someone is sabotaging every opportunity we get." Jake sat next to her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Don't give up. We'll think of something." Elizabeth rested her head on his shoulder. "How was your job search today?" Jake sighed. "Nothing. It's strange, you know? I get interviews, they seem to like me, but then they never hire me." Elizabeth frowned. Something wasn't right. There were too many coincidences. That night, while Jake was taking a shower, Elizabeth heard a soft melody coming from the bathroom. Curious, she approached the door. Jake's voice was surprisingly beautiful, rich, and emotional. Elizabeth was stunned. How had she never heard Jake sing before? When Jake came out of the shower, Elizabeth confronted him. "Why didn't you ever tell me you could sing like that?" Jake looked embarrassed. "Oh, that? It's just a hobby." "A hobby? Jake, you have an incredible talent," Elizabeth exclaimed. "Why don't you ever do anything with it?" Jake looked away. I can't." Elizabeth took his hands. "Why not?" Jake hesitated, then spoke softly. In Afghanistan, I used to sing for my unit. The night before we lost 2 men, I sang for them. Ever since, I can't sing in public without remembering. Elizabeth hugged him tightly. I'm so sorry, Jake. I didn't know. They sat in silence for a moment, then Elizabeth had an idea. What if we start small? Maybe you could just sing for me? Jake smiled slightly. I think I can try that. In the days that followed, Jake sang for Elizabeth every night. His confidence slowly grew, and Elizabeth noticed a change in him. The music seemed to heal something inside Jake. One afternoon, as Jake hummed while making dinner, Elizabeth had an epiphany. Jake, what if we use your talent? We could try street performances, maybe even get gigs at bars. Jake stopped singing, fear visible in his eyes. I don't know, Lizzie. Singing in public. Elizabeth took his hands. I know it's scary. But think of it as a mission. A mission to get us out of this situation. Jake took a deep breath, considering. Finally, he nodded. Okay. Let's try. They started planning. Elizabeth used her photography skills to create promotional posters. Jake practiced every day, gaining confidence. Meanwhile, Elizabeth couldn't stop thinking about the lost opportunities. Determined to figure out what was going on, she started investigating. After days of phone calls and emails, Elizabeth finally got a crucial piece of information. The gallery mentioned they'd received a call from someone claiming to be her agent, canceling the exhibition. But I don't have an agent, Elizabeth murmured to herself. Then, the realization hit her like lightning. There was only one person with enough influence to do this. Dad, she whispered, anger rising within her. Victor was behind everything. The lost opportunities, the jobs Jake didn't get. It all made sense now. Elizabeth wanted to scream, cry, confront her father. But she knew that wouldn't help. They needed a better plan. That night, she told Jake about her discovery. My father is sabotaging our lives, she said, her voice trembling with anger. Jake hugged her tightly. We won't let him win, Lizzie. We have each other, and now we have a plan. Elizabeth nodded, determined. You're right. We're going to show him he can't bring us down. The next morning, they left early. They found a busy spot in the city center and set up their makeshift stage. Elizabeth arranged the posters while Jake tuned the second-hand guitar they had bought. When everything was ready, Jake froze. His face went pale, and his breathing became erratic. I can't do this, he muttered. Elizabeth saw the panic in his eyes. This was the moment she had feared but was prepared for. She stepped close, holding Jake's hands. Look at me, she said gently. You can do this. Remember, it's just you and me. Like at home. Jake closed his eyes, taking deep breaths. Elizabeth kept speaking softly, calming him. Slowly, the color returned to Jake's face. He opened his eyes, looking at Elizabeth with determination. Okay, he said. Let's do this. Jake took his position, guitar in hand. Elizabeth stepped back, camera ready to capture the moment. The first notes came out, hesitant. Jake looked at Elizabeth, who nodded encouragingly. Then, he started to sing. Jake's voice echoed through the busy street. At first, few paid attention, but as the music flowed, a small crowd began to gather. Elizabeth watched, moved, as Jake sang with his eyes closed, lost in the music. She could see the tension leaving his body with every note. When the song ended, there was a brief moment of silence before the crowd erupted into applause. Jake opened his eyes, surprised by the reaction. A hesitant smile formed on his face. "Encore," someone shouted from the crowd. Jake looked at Elizabeth, who nodded encouragingly. With growing confidence, Jake started another song. This time, his voice was stronger, more assured. People stopped to listen, some recording with their phones. Among the crowd, a man watched with particular interest. When Jake finished his small performance, the man approached. "Hello, I'm Mark Stevens, a music producer," he introduced himself, handing Jake a card. "You've got an incredible talent. I'd love to talk about some opportunities." Jake and Elizabeth exchanged glances, barely believing what they were hearing. "Of course," Jake replied, still breathless from the performance. They scheduled a meeting for the next day. As they walked home, Elizabeth was bursting with joy. "You were amazing, Jake," she exclaimed. "I knew you could do it." Jake smiled, still processing what had happened. "Thank you for encouraging me, Lizzie. I couldn't have done it without you." The next morning, they met with Mark. The producer was enthusiastic about Jake's potential. "Your voice has something special," Mark explained. "I'd like to record some demos with you, see where this takes us." Jake hesitated, looking at Elizabeth. She squeezed his hand, encouraging. "It's a great opportunity, Jake," she said softly. Jake nodded. "Okay, let's do it." In the weeks that followed, Jake worked with Mark in the studio. Elizabeth accompanied him whenever she could, proud to see him flourish. One day, while Jake was recording, Mark approached Elizabeth. "You know, we're thinking about releasing a music video for the first song. Your photos are amazing. Would you like to direct it?" Elizabeth was surprised. "Me? But I've never directed a music video before." Mark smiled. "Sometimes a fresh perspective is exactly what we need." Elizabeth accepted the challenge. She worked hard on the concept and execution of the video, pouring her heart into the project. Finally, the day of the release arrived. The music video premiered on a local music channel. Jake and Elizabeth watched together, barely breathing with anxiety. The reaction was immediate and positive. Social media exploded with comments about the newly discovered talent. Mark's phone wouldn't stop ringing. Meanwhile, in his mansion, Victor Hawthorne watched TV, a glass of whiskey in hand. His eyes widened as he recognized Jake on the screen. "It can't be," he muttered, turning up the volume. As he watched, his anger grew. He saw Elizabeth's name in the credits as the video's director. His face turned red with fury. "They think they can make a fool of me," he shouted at the empty room, throwing the glass against the wall. Victor stood up, slightly stumbling. He had drunk too much, but he didn't care. He had to do something, anything. He grabbed his car keys and stormed out, ignoring his driver's warnings. "I'll drive," he shouted, getting into his sports car. Victor sped down the road, his mind clouded by anger and alcohol. Images from the music video flashed in his mind, fueling his rage. He didn't see the curve coming. When he did, it was too late. The car skidded, flipping several times before coming to a stop. The next morning, Elizabeth was woken by a phone call. Her heart froze as she heard the voice on the other end. "Miss Hawthorne? This is Central Hospital. Your father has been in a serious accident." Elizabeth woke Jake, her hands trembling. "My father. He's been in an accident. We need to go to the hospital." They dressed quickly and rushed to the hospital. On the way, Elizabeth wrestled with a mix of emotions: worry, anger, guilt. At the hospital, they were greeted by a doctor with a grave expression. "Miss Hawthorne, your father is stable, but..." Elizabeth held her breath, squeezing Jake's hand. The impact caused damage to his spine. He's paralyzed from the waist down. Elizabeth felt her legs give way. Jake held her, keeping her from collapsing. There's one more thing, the doctor continued. Tests showed a high level of alcohol in his blood. Your father was driving under the influence. Elizabeth closed her eyes, feeling the weight of this revelation. All the resentment she felt for her father was momentarily replaced by a deep sadness. Can we see him? Jake asked, his voice calm and steady. The doctor nodded. He's in the ICU. Follow me. As they walked through the hospital corridors, Elizabeth braced herself to face her father. She didn't know what to expect, but she knew nothing would ever be the same. Elizabeth and Jake entered the Hawthorne mansion, carrying their luggage. The place seemed larger and colder than Elizabeth remembered. Miss Elizabeth, it's good to see you, Maria, the housekeeper said with a tense smile. Your father's room is ready downstairs. Elizabeth nodded. Thank you, Maria. How is he? Difficult, Maria sighed. He's not making it easy for anyone. Jake squeezed Elizabeth's hand, offering silent support. They headed to Victor's room. When they entered, they found Victor in bed, staring out the window. He turned his head when he heard them, his face a mask of bitterness. So, you've come, he said, his voice cold. Come to see the fallen old man, Elizabeth? Elizabeth took a deep breath. We've come to help, Dad. Victor laughed without humor. Help? How? Are you going to make me walk again? Jake stepped forward. Mr. Hawthorne, we're here for whatever you need. Victor glared at him. I don't need your pity, boy. Elizabeth intervened. Enough, Dad. We're here, whether you like it or not. The following days were tense. Victor was a difficult patient, constantly complaining and rejecting help. Elizabeth alternated between frustration and guilt, while Jake did his best to keep the peace. One afternoon, while organizing some things in Victor's old room, Elizabeth found a dusty box at the back of the closet. Inside were old photographs. Her heart raced as she recognized her mother in the pictures. In one, her mother held a professional camera, smiling beside a group of famous photographers. Was she a photographer? Elizabeth murmured in surprise. Meanwhile, Jake was helping organize Victor's office. Sifting through some papers, he found strange documents, contracts, bank transfers to offshore accounts. Something didn't seem right. That night, Elizabeth showed Jake the photos. She looks so happy here, Elizabeth said. Why did my father never tell me about this? Jake frowned. I don't know, Lizzie. But I think I found something strange in your father's office. He showed the documents to Elizabeth, explaining his suspicions. This doesn't make sense, Elizabeth said. Why would my father have secret accounts? The next day, during lunch, Victor was particularly bitter. Why are you here, Elizabeth? He asked. To get revenge? To see me suffer? Elizabeth slammed her fork down. Enough, Dad. I'm here because, despite everything, I care about you. But I need answers. She pulled the photos from her pocket and threw them on the table. Why did you never tell me my mother was a photographer? Victor paled. For a moment, his mask of bitterness fell, revealing pain and guilt. Where did you find these? He asked, his voice trembling. That doesn't matter, Elizabeth insisted. I want the truth. Now. Victor closed his eyes, suddenly looking old and tired. Your mother. She was more than just a photographer, he began. She was a talented artist, internationally recognized. Elizabeth's heart tightened. Why did you hide this from me? Victor opened his eyes, filled with unshed tears. Because I was the one who destroyed her career. The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth felt Jake squeeze her hand under the table, offering support. What do you mean? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Victor seemed to be fighting an internal battle. Finally, he spoke. I was building my empire. I needed a wife who could support me, attend events, take care of the home. Your mother's career was taking off, and she was traveling a lot. I made her choose. Elizabeth felt as if she had been punched. You made her give up everything? For your ego? Victor didn't answer, but his silence was enough. How could you? Elizabeth asked, tears streaming down her face. She must have been devastated. She was, Victor admitted, his voice breaking. But at the time, I only thought about myself. By the time I realized my mistake, it was too late. Elizabeth stood abruptly, unable to listen any longer. She left the room, Jake right behind her. In the hallway, Elizabeth turned to Jake, trembling. Can you believe this? He ruined her career. Everything I've ever wanted, my passion for photography. It comes from her. Jake held her tight. I'm so sorry, Lizzie. But now you know. You can honor her legacy. Elizabeth nodded against Jake's chest, her mind spinning with this new information. She knew nothing would ever be the same after this revelation. The image she had of her father, of her family, was changing forever. And there were still the suspicious documents Jake had found. What else was her father hiding? Elizabeth pulled away from Jake, wiping her tears. We need to find out more, she said, determined. About my mother, about these documents. There's more to this story, Jake. And I'm going to find out what it is. Jake nodded, holding her hand. I'm with you, Lizzie. We'll get to the bottom of this. The next morning, Elizabeth found Victor in his office, looking at pictures of her mother. Dad, we need to talk, she said, sitting across from him. Victor nodded, his eyes tired. You deserve to know the truth, Elizabeth. He began to tell the story. I met your mother, Claire, at an art exhibition. She was stunning, not just for her beauty but for her talent. Her photographs captured the essence of people. Elizabeth listened, absorbing every word. We fell in love quickly, Victor continued. But I was building my empire, and Claire was at the height of her career. She traveled the world, capturing images that made people stop and think. He paused, guilt evident on his face. I proposed to her, promising to support her career. But reality was different. I wanted a wife at home, not an artist traveling the world. Elizabeth felt the anger rising. So you made her choose? Victor nodded sadly. She chose our family. But part of her died that day. I tried to make it up to her, but the damage was done. And how did she really die? Elizabeth asked, dreading the answer. Victor closed his eyes, tears streaming down. Depression. She took her own life, Elizabeth. It wasn't a car accident like I said. Elizabeth felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. How could you lie about that? I didn't know how to handle the truth, Victor admitted. I thought I was protecting you. Meanwhile, Jake continued investigating the documents he had found. Analyzing the numbers, he noticed alarming discrepancies. This can't be right, he muttered, double-checking the calculations. Deciding to get some fresh air, Jake went out to the gardens. That's when he noticed a man watching the mansion from across the street. The stranger seemed to be photographing the property. Back in the office, Elizabeth struggled to process the revelations. "My mother, she was amazing," Elizabeth said, looking at the photos. "And you suffocated her." Victor hung his head. "I know I can't change the past, Elizabeth. But I want you to know that your mother was extraordinary. Her talent was unique." Elizabeth picked up one of the photos, studying it closely. "She captured more than images, didn't she?" "She captured emotions." Victor nodded. "She had a gift. Something I see in you, too." Elizabeth felt a mix of pride and sadness. "Why didn't you ever tell me this before?" "Shame," Victor admitted. "Guilt. Every time I saw you with the camera, I was reminded of what I did to Claire." At that moment, Jake entered the office, looking concerned. "Elizabeth, Mr. Hawthorne, sorry to interrupt, but there's something you need to see." Jake showed them the documents he had found, explaining his discoveries. There seemed to be significant discrepancies in the company's accounts. Unauthorized transfers, embezzled funds. Victor went pale. "That's impossible. I oversaw everything personally." "Apparently not," Jake said, showing more papers. "This has been going on for years." Elizabeth looked between her father and Jake, confused. "What does this mean?" "It means someone is stealing from the company," Jake explained. "And making it look like your father is responsible." Victor looked stunned. "But who?" Before he could finish, Maria rushed in. "Sir, there's a man at the door. He says he's from the Financial Investigations Department." Panic crossed Victor's face. Elizabeth and Jake exchanged worried glances. "I'll talk to him," Jake offered, stepping out of the room. In the foyer, Jake met a man in a suit, his expression serious. "Can I help you?" Jake asked. The man studied him for a moment. "I'm Investigator Roberts. I'm conducting an investigation into possible fraudulent activities at Hawthorne Enterprises." Jake kept his composure. "I see. Right now, Mr. Hawthorne isn't in a position to take visitors. Perhaps we could schedule an appointment?" Robert smiled, but there was no warmth in his eyes. "Of course. But before I go, there's something you should see." He handed Jake an envelope. "Information about Mr. Hawthorne that might interest you, especially considering your current situation." Jake hesitated, taking the envelope. "What do you mean?" "Let's just say I know about the ultimatum, the forced marriage," Roberts said. "And I know you and Miss Hawthorne are in a delicate position." Jake felt a chill down his spine. How did he know about that? "Read the contents," Roberts continued. "Then call me. We can make a deal that benefits everyone." With that, the investigators turned and left, leaving Jake holding the envelope, his mind spinning with the implications of what he had just heard. Jake looked at the envelope in his hands, knowing its contents could change everything. He had to tell Elizabeth, but how? And what would they do with this information? With a heavy heart, Jake closed the door, knowing that today's revelations were only the beginning. The full truth was still to come, and he feared what else they might uncover. Elizabeth spent the next few days rummaging through the mansion's attic, uncovering boxes upon boxes of her mother's work. Each photograph revealed a new aspect of Claire's talent. "Look at this, Jake," Elizabeth called, holding up a framed photo. "She won the national award with this picture." Jake approached, admiring the photograph of a smiling child among ruins. "It's powerful," he commented. "Your mother had a gift." Elizabeth nodded, emotional. "I feel like I'm getting to know her for the first time." Meanwhile, Jake wrestled with the weight of the secret he carried. Investigator Roberts was pressuring him daily for information about Victor and the company. "We don't have much time, Mr. Collins," Robert said during a call. "Either you cooperate, or I'll have to use other methods." Jake hung up, feeling trapped. He knew he needed to tell Elizabeth, but he feared the consequences. In his office, Victor received increasingly alarming news about the state of the company. "Mr. Hawthorne, the stocks are plummeting," his assistant informed him. "Investors are panicking over rumors of fraud." Victor ran his hand over his face, looking aged. "How did I let this happen?" Elizabeth entered the office, carrying a photo album. "Dad, look what I found. These are Mom's first pictures." She stopped, noticing Victor's troubled expression. "What happened?" Victor hesitated, then decided to be honest. "The company is in crisis, Elizabeth. I could lose everything." Elizabeth was shocked. "But how? What can we do?" "I don't know," Victor admitted. "I spent my life building this, and now—" Elizabeth placed the album on the desk. "Maybe it's time to focus on what really matters, Dad." Victor looked at Claire's photos, then at Elizabeth. "You're right. I've already lost too much because of business." That night, Jake finally decided to tell Elizabeth about the investigator. They met in the garden, far from Victor's ears. "Lizzie, there's something I need to tell you," Jake began, nervous. Before he could continue, Elizabeth doubled over in pain. "Jake," she screamed, clutching her stomach. Jake held her, alarmed. "What is it?" "The baby?" "It hurts," Elizabeth groaned. "Something's wrong." Jake scooped her up, rushing into the house. "Maria," he shouted. "Call an ambulance." At the hospital, the doctors examined Elizabeth urgently. "Her blood pressure is very high," the doctor informed them. "The stress is affecting the baby. We need to monitor her closely." Jake held Elizabeth's hand, feeling guilty. He should have told her about the investigator sooner. Now, Elizabeth and the baby were at risk. Victor arrived at the hospital, looking lost in his wheelchair. "How is she?" he asked Jake. "Stable for now," Jake replied. "But the baby is at risk." Victor closed his eyes, guilt written all over his face. "This is all my fault. My mistakes keep affecting my family." Jake hesitated, then decided it was time for the truth. "Mr. Hawthorne, there's something I need to tell you. About the company and an investigator named Roberts." Victor looked at Jake, surprised. "What do you know about this?" Jake explained Roberts' approaches, the threats, and the blackmail. Victor listened in silence, his face growing paler with each word. "Roberts," Victor murmured. "I know that name." At that moment, as if summoned by the mention of his name, Roberts appeared in the hospital corridor. "Mr. Hawthorne," he said, a cold smile on his lips. "What a coincidence to find you here." Jake stepped between Roberts and Victor. "What do you want?" Roberts laughed. "Just to talk. About the past, the present, and the future of the Hawthorne family." Victor stared at Roberts. "Who are you really?" "Let's just say I'm an old acquaintance," Roberts replied. "I'm here on behalf of someone you betrayed a long time ago. Someone who wants what's rightfully theirs." The realization hit Victor. "Maxwell," he whispered. "You work for Maxwell." Roberts smiled. "Bingo. Your old partner sends his regards. And he says it's time to settle the score." Jake looked from Victor to Roberts, confused. "Who's Maxwell?" "My ex-partner," Victor explained, his voice trembling. "I kicked him out of the company years ago. He swore revenge. And now," Roberts said, "he's about to get what he wants." Unless you're willing to negotiate, Mr. Hawthorne. Before Victor could respond, an alarm went off in Elizabeth's room. Doctors and nurses rushed in. Jake turned, his heart racing. Elizabeth. Robert stepped back, still smiling. Think about my offer, Mr. Hawthorne. I'll be in touch. Jake ran to Elizabeth's room, leaving Victor alone in the corridor, torn between fear for his company's future and concern for his daughter and grandson. Inside the room, doctors were fighting to stabilize Elizabeth. We're losing the baby, one of them shouted. Jake held Elizabeth's hand, tears in his eyes. Stay with me, Lizzie. Please, stay with me. The hospital was quiet, except for the constant beep of the monitors in Elizabeth's room. Jake sat beside her, holding her hand, while Victor waited in the hallway, unable to enter with his wheelchair. Mr. Hawthorne, Jake called, stepping out of the room. We need to talk. Victor nodded, and they moved to a private room. Jake took a deep breath and began telling him everything about Robert's blackmail and the evidence of fraud he had found. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Victor asked, his voice more tired than angry. I wanted to protect Elizabeth, Jake admitted. But now I see that was a mistake. Victor was silent for a moment, then said, You're not the only one who's made mistakes, Jake. The truth is, the company is in much worse shape than you think. He explained how years of questionable decisions and risky deals had left the company vulnerable. Maxwell, my former partner, must have noticed that and is using Roberts to pressure us. Jake frowned. But why? What does he gain from this? Revenge, Victor answered simply. And the chance to take control of the company he helped build. The two men fell silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Finally, Jake spoke, We need a plan. Something to expose Maxwell and save the company. Victor looked at Jake, surprised. We? Jake nodded. Yes, we. For Elizabeth and the baby. For the first time, Victor saw Jake not as the man who had stolen his daughter, but as an ally. Okay, he said. Let's figure something out. Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Elizabeth slowly woke up. She saw the photos of her mother that Jake had brought, scattered around her. Picking one up, she felt a deep connection to Claire. Help me be strong, Mom, she whispered. For this baby. Over the next few hours, Jake and Victor worked together, going through documents and devising strategies. Slowly, a plan began to take shape. If we can prove that Maxwell is behind the fraudulent transfers, Jake said, we can not only save the company but also clear you of any charges. Victor nodded. But it's risky. If Maxwell finds out what we're doing. It's a risk we have to take, Jake insisted. They kept working, stopping only to check on Elizabeth. On one of these visits, they found her awake and stronger. What are you two up to? She asked, noticing the camaraderie between them. Jake and Victor exchanged glances. We're trying to fix some company issues, Jake explained vaguely. Elizabeth steadied them. There's more to it. Tell me everything. Reluctantly, they explained the situation. Elizabeth listened, her expression growing more determined with each word. I want to help, she said firmly. No, Victor and Jake said in unison. You need to rest, Victor insisted, surprising himself with his concern. Elizabeth took her father's hand. Dad, I know we're going through a lot, but we need to be honest with each other. No more secrets. Victor looked at his daughter, then at Jake. He felt the weight of years of lies and half-truths. It was time for full honesty. You're right, he said softly. There's something you both need to know. About your mother, Elizabeth. Jake sat up, sensing that he was about to hear something important. Victor began to speak, his voice trembling. "I told you your mother died in a car accident. The truth is, she took her own life." Elizabeth gasped, tears filling her eyes. Jake held her hand tightly. "Why?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Victor closed his eyes, guilt evident in every line of his face. "Because I suffocated her. My greed, my pride. I made her give up her career, her dreams. She fell into depression, and I was too busy with the company to see how much she was suffering." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth cried quietly, while Jake tried to process the revelation. "I loved her," Victor continued, tears streaming down his face. "But not enough to put her first. And now, I'm making the same mistake with you, Elizabeth." Elizabeth wiped her tears, looking at her father with a mix of pain and understanding. "That's why you reacted so badly when I wanted to pursue photography." Victor nodded. "I saw your mother in you. And I was scared. Scared that you'd meet the same fate." Jake, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Mr. Hawthorne, we can't change the past. But we can do things differently now." Victor looked at Jake with newfound respect. "You're right. And that's what we're going to do." They spent the next few hours refining their plan to expose Maxwell. It was risky, but it was their only chance. "It's settled then," Jake said finally. "Tomorrow, we put the plan into action." Elizabeth took Jake's hand and her father's. "Together," she said firmly. Victor nodded, feeling for the first time in years that he was doing the right thing. Together. As night fell, the three prepared for the next day, knowing that everything was at stake. The future of the company, the family, and Claire's legacy depended on the success of their plan. Jake looked at Elizabeth, sleeping peacefully, and at Victor, who finally seemed at peace with himself. He knew the risks were enormous, but for the first time, he felt they had a real chance to win. With renewed determination, Jake prepared for the battle ahead. Tomorrow, they would face Maxwell and fight for the future Claire had wanted for her family. The hospital was quiet, except for the constant beep of the monitors in Elizabeth's room. Jake sat beside her, holding her hand, while Victor waited in the hallway, unable to enter with his wheelchair. "Mr. Hawthorne," Jake called, stepping out of the room. "We need to talk." Victor nodded, and they moved to a private room. Jake took a deep breath and began telling him everything about Robert's blackmail and the evidence of fraud he had found. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Victor asked, his voice more tired than angry. "I wanted to protect Elizabeth," Jake admitted. "But now I see that was a mistake." Victor was silent for a moment, then said, "You're not the only one who's made mistakes, Jake. The truth is, the company is in much worse shape than you think." He explained how years of questionable decisions and risky deals had left the company vulnerable. "Maxwell, my former partner, must have noticed that and is using Roberts to pressure us." Jake frowned. "But why? What does he gain from this?" "Revenge," Victor answered simply. "And the chance to take control of the company he helped build." The two men fell silent, the weight of the situation pressing down on them. Finally, Jake spoke, "We need a plan. Something to expose Maxwell and save the company." Victor looked at Jake, surprised. "We?" Jake nodded. "Yes, we. For Elizabeth and the baby." For the first time, Victor saw Jake not as the man who had stolen his daughter, but as an ally. "Okay," he said. "Let's figure something out." Meanwhile, in the hospital room, Elizabeth slowly woke up. She saw the photos of her mother that Jake had brought, scattered around her. Picking one up, she felt a deep connection to Claire. "Help me be strong, Mom," she whispered. "For this baby." Over the next few hours, Jake and Victor worked together, going through documents and devising strategies. Slowly, a plan began to take shape. "If we can prove that Maxwell is behind the fraudulent transfers," Jake said, "we can not only save the company but also clear you of any charges." Victor nodded. "But it's risky. If Maxwell finds out what we're doing." "It's a risk we have to take," Jake insisted. They kept working, stopping only to check on Elizabeth. On one of these visits, they found her awake and stronger. "What are you two up to?" she asked, noticing the camaraderie between them. Jake and Victor exchanged glances. "We're trying to fix some company issues," Jake explained vaguely. Elizabeth steadied them. "There's more to it. Tell me everything." Reluctantly, they explained the situation. Elizabeth listened, her expression growing more determined with each word. "I want to help," she said firmly. "No," Victor and Jake said in unison. "You need to rest," Victor insisted, surprising himself with his concern. Elizabeth took her father's hand. "Dad, I know we're going through a lot, but we need to be honest with each other. No more secrets." Victor looked at his daughter, then at Jake. He felt the weight of years of lies and half-truths. It was time for full honesty. "You're right," he said softly. "There's something you both need to know. About your mother, Elizabeth." Jake sat up, sensing that he was about to hear something important. Victor began to speak, his voice trembling. "I told you your mother died in a car accident. The truth is, she took her own life." Elizabeth gasped, tears filling her eyes. Jake held her hand tightly. "Why?" Elizabeth asked, her voice barely a whisper. Victor closed his eyes, guilt evident in every line of his face. "Because I suffocated her. My greed, my pride. I made her give up her career, her dreams. She fell into depression, and I was too busy with the company to see how much she was suffering." The silence that followed was deafening. Elizabeth cried quietly, while Jake tried to process the revelation. "I loved her," Victor continued, tears streaming down his face. "But not enough to put her first. And now, I'm making the same mistake with you, Elizabeth." Elizabeth wiped her tears, looking at her father with a mix of pain and understanding. "That's why you reacted so badly when I wanted to pursue photography." Victor nodded. "I saw your mother in you. And I was scared. Scared that you'd meet the same fate." Jake, who had remained silent, finally spoke. "Mr. Hawthorne, we can't change the past. But we can do things differently now." Victor looked at Jake with newfound respect. "You're right. And that's what we're going to do." They spent the next few hours refining their plan to expose Maxwell. It was risky, but it was their only chance. "It's settled then," Jake said finally. "Tomorrow, we put the plan into action." Elizabeth took Jake's hand and her father's. "Together," she said firmly. Victor nodded, feeling for the first time in years that he was doing the right thing. Together. As night fell, the three prepared for the next day, knowing that everything was at stake. The future of the company, the family, and Claire's legacy depended on the success of their plan. Jake looked at Elizabeth, sleeping peacefully, and at Victor, who finally seemed at peace with himself. He knew the risks were enormous, but for the first time, he felt they had a real chance to win. With renewed determination, Jake prepared for the battle ahead. Tomorrow, they would face Maxwell and fight for the future Claire had wanted for her family. Elizabeth walked into the boardroom of Hawthorne Enterprises, feeling all eyes on her. The board members, mostly older men, watched her with clear skepticism. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady despite the internal nerves, "I know I'm not who you expected to lead this meeting. But the circumstances have changed, and I'm here to ensure the future of this company." One of the directors cleared his throat. "Ms. Hawthorne, with all due respect, you don't have any corporate management experience." Elizabeth nodded. "That's true. But I have something no one else here has, a personal stake in the success and integrity of this company. And I'm willing to learn." While Elizabeth battled in the boardroom, Jake faced his own challenges. The song he sang during the operation to expose Maxwell had leaked online and gone viral. Now, he was being flooded with offers from music labels. "Jake, you need to take advantage of this opportunity," his new agent insisted over the phone. Jake looked at the picture of Elizabeth on his desk. "I can't leave my family now. They need me." "What if we could use your music to help?" the agent suggested. "Maybe a charity concert?" The idea sparked something in Jake's mind. That could work. In the following weeks, Elizabeth dove headfirst into managing the company. She spent nights studying financial reports, learning about the company's operations. Her determination began to earn the reluctant respect of the board. Meanwhile, Jake organized a huge charity concert. He called it Music for Redemption, with all proceeds going to a fund supporting families affected by corporate crimes. The night of the concert arrived. Elizabeth, now 8 months pregnant, watched from backstage, feeling proud. Jake stepped onto the stage, his voice stronger than ever. "This song," he said into the microphone, "is for anyone who's ever made mistakes but is fighting to make things right." As Jake sang, Elizabeth felt a sharp pain. Her face paled as she realized the baby was coming. "Jake," she shouted, but her voice was drowned out by the music. Backstage, chaos erupted. Elizabeth was rushed to the hospital, while Jake, unaware, continued his performance. At the hospital, doctors scrambled. "It's too early," one of them murmured. "We need to do an emergency C-section." Elizabeth, alone and scared, thought of her mother. "Give me strength," she whispered. Hours later, Jake arrived at the hospital, breathless. "Where is she? What happened?" A nurse led him to a small room in the neonatal ICU. There, he saw Elizabeth, pale but smiling, holding a tiny baby. "Jake, meet our daughter," she said softly. Jake felt tears welling up. "She's perfect," he whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. "Claire," Elizabeth said. "Her name is Claire." As the Hawthorne family celebrated the arrival of their newest member, Victor sat alone in his cell. The news of his granddaughter's birth had reached him, bringing a mix of joy and deep sadness. He picked up a pen and began to write. Pages and pages of confessions, detailing every mistake, every wrong decision that had led him there. "I can't change the past," he wrote, "but I can make sure the truth is known." Days later, Victor's lawyer handed the confessions to the prosecutor. "He's willing to plead guilty to all charges," the lawyer explained. In return, he asks only that his daughter and the company be spared further investigation. The prosecutor flipped through the pages, surprised. This could mean a very long sentence. "He may never leave prison." "He's aware of that," the lawyer replied. Back at Hawthorne Enterprises, Elizabeth faced her biggest challenge yet, a shareholders' meeting that would determine the future of the company. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, with Claire peacefully sleeping in her arms, "I know many of you have doubts about my ability to lead this company. But I ask you to look not to the past, but to the future we can build together." She presented a bold restructuring plan, focused on ethical practices and social responsibility. When she finished, the room was silent. Then, slowly, applause began. Soon, the entire room was giving her a standing ovation. Jake, watching from the back of the room, felt a wave of pride. Elizabeth had found her voice, her strength. That night, exhausted but content, Elizabeth found a letter waiting for her at home. Her father's familiar handwriting made her heart tighten. "My dear Elizabeth," the letter began, "there's so much I need to tell you. Can we meet one last time?" Elizabeth looked at Jake, then at Claire, sleeping in her crib. She knew this decision could change everything again. "What do you think?" she asked Jake. Jake took her hand. "I think it's time to close this chapter, so we can start the next." Elizabeth nodded, feeling a mix of apprehension and hope. Tomorrow, she would face her father one last time, not as the girl he once knew, but as the woman, mother, and leader she had become. Elizabeth entered the prison visiting room, her heart pounding. Victor was already there, smaller and more fragile in his uniform. "Elizabeth," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "You came." After a long silence, Elizabeth asked, "Why did you want to see me, Dad?" Victor took a deep breath. "To ask for forgiveness and to tell you how proud I am of you." Tears welled up in Elizabeth's eyes as she responded, "Dad, you hurt us so much." "I know," he said, "and I'll regret it forever. But I want you to know that now I understand what truly matters." They talked for hours, healing old wounds. When the visit ended, Elizabeth felt lighter. "Take good care of my granddaughter," Victor said as they said their goodbyes. Elizabeth nodded. "She'll know the man you've become." Days later, at Elizabeth's exhibition, Jake dedicated a song to his wife and their daughter, Claire. His emotional voice told the story of love and redemption they had lived. The audience applauded, and with Claire in her arms, Elizabeth felt the weight of all the changes. Taking the stage, Elizabeth opened the Legacy exhibition, revealing photos that told the story of her family and many others who had faced challenges. Suddenly, Victor entered, escorted by guards, surprising Elizabeth. "Parole for the day," Victor explained. "I couldn't miss this." He became emotional as he held Claire, admiring her mother's eyes in her. At the end, Elizabeth announced the creation of the Claire Hawthorne Foundation to support struggling artists in honor of her mother. Victor, filled with remorse, watched with pride. The night ended with Elizabeth, Jake, and Claire united, ready for the future. As Victor was taken back to prison, he knew the Hawthorne legacy was in good hands. If you enjoyed this touching story, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts or ideas, and of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our upcoming stories. After all, the power of love and redemption is always waiting for us. We just need the courage to rewrite our own destiny.